So good morning, everyone. My name is Michaela Lenčišová. I'm from Czech Academy of Sciences and also from ENRIO. And today I'm the chair of very interesting oral session number 6, Hard and Soft Laws, the Regulatory Landscape of Research Integrity. We have here 4 very interesting lectures, and I would like to invite our first speaker, Kalle Videnoja from University of Helsinki and from TENG. And he's going to talk about differences and similarities between European research integrity systems.
Thank you, Michaela. And thanks for everyone else appearing here. I try to keep this presentation as sharp and focused as possible, in spite of having perhaps drank too many yesterday at the wine reception, but I think this is going to be just fine. So my name is Kalle Videnoja, and I have to first disclose this kind of a conflict of commitment. I'm here presenting as a researcher at Helsinki University, but I'm also an employee of Finnish National Board on Research Integrity TENG. So when I'm investigating this European regulatory environment, I'm also investigating our office. My findings are not normative in their nature. They are descriptive, so I don't think there's a huge problem in that. Perhaps I could say I was quite intrigued. I've been studying also like a pluralistic legal structures, and our community, our research integrity community in Europe, it's very pluralistic, and this is why I'm trying to give you an oversight of how I've perceived this structure here. Data here, it's collected in an Horizon Europe project called Prepared. It's part of the legal analysis of the project, and the presentation here is based on a research manuscript that is written by me and Professor Erika Löfström and Dr. Loretta Toginiene. As a background, we have a research question. In what sense do differences and similarities emerge in European research integrity system? And I'm starting this to approach this question from the background of harmonization, and because why would we need harmonization of European research integrity regulation? The answer is obviously that research enterprise is international by its nature, and as many codes of conduct, for example, Singapore Statement says that also the norms that guide this research should be international, and there are quite many hardships in achieving this, like universality in this codes of conduct, but we'll come to that a bit later. And I must say that harmonization, it can happen on multiple levels. It can stem from aspirational role of guidances of some institution, and it can like be also achieved through soft law arrangement and even through like hard law regulation. And this is not the first time that someone is trying to categorize European research integrity systems. There is some preliminary work, for example, this year, or was it late last year? It was on Perkovits-Palos et al. They published a paper, and for my purposes, I think very good paper is from Desmond and Diegrich, who identified some perhaps concerns regarding the pluralism of application of these like kinds of codes of conduct. And they said that there's that these codes can be interpreted in different ways, and when a researcher is alleged of misconduct, it can be that they are treated differently in different organizations or in different parts of Europe, in different countries. But I think that even more serious concern can be raised, and that is that if there are no obligatory procedures for enforcing these research integrity principles, then these codes of conduct, they can turn out to be merely like window dressing. If like we might have like good and beautiful things in those codes, but who says that anyone is implementing them in any meaningful way? I start this by referring my theoretical background is in philosophy, and Walter Price Galib has coined this term called essentially contested concept. What does this mean, and why it's important for us? I think basically the term describes arguments revolving our normative concepts that are like generally agreed upon. Like, for example, we can say honesty. Yes, it is. We can all agree that in research work, honesty is very important, but the scope and realization of this norm is disputed by the users. And why it is perhaps a concern for us, it is because if research integrity is essentially contested concept, it might be hardly possible to find a comprehensive definition of research integrity that could demarcate this concept from other surrounding phenomena or norms that are related to, for example, open science or research ethics or responsible assessment of researchers. And here we can see, I think you can all see the slide, that there are 7 criteria for a concept to be essentially contested according to Galli thesis, and it must signify some kind of valued achievement, and this evaluated content must be attributed to it as a whole. Any explanation of its word must notice the respective contributions to its components, and any explanation of its word must notice the I read that. The valued achievement must be open to modification in case of a change in circumstances. And each party must recognize the fact that its own use of this concept is contested by those of other parties. And there's no one authority whose definition of the concept is accepted by all parties, and it is plausible that the competition of rival conceptions, they might work in advance of conceptualizing the valued outcome. And I just go briefly, I would suggest that research integrity is a concept that fulfills all these 7 criteria, because we can go in more detail about this after the presentation, but the concept research integrity, it describes valued outcome. I think this is quite obvious. And the concept is a complex one, including many fundamental principles. And these fundamental principles have all their own purpose. The concept is not limited to one context and one use, and there are active discussions with the aim of developing shared understanding on the subject in a reflexive manner. And I think one proof of this point is that ENRIO just has established working group to define research integrity, and the work is not easy. So I hope you, for the sake of argument, you believe that research integrity is a contested concept in its essence, and we can go to the actual data collection. What we've done here, we have collected publicly available data from 27 European countries. The inclusion criteria for this was that these parties have been part of an EU project that were fed into Embassy of Good Sciences country reports. And then the second inclusion criteria was that we've included all ENRIO members, because we have quite comprehensive data on ENRIO members and the research integrity landscapes in the respective countries. And then we employed qualitative content analysis to identify relevant differences in national research integrity systems and the work of these offices. There are already findings on this slide. I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but I think it's a hardly surprise if I say already now that the findings suggest that the functions and powers of research integrity offices in Europe are very significant, like very much. Then we were able to basically to draw maps. I think these are like nice pedagogical tools. First is the competence in handling allegations of research misconduct, and probably you can read the descriptions behind the colors, so that and we can see that most countries, they have like a voluntary system, and this means that research organizations, they have their own codes of conduct and their own research misconduct investigation procedures, and usually they do not share much data with each other. Sometimes they do, and I must say that this is not really clear cut, because there are like things that are in between. And then on green we can see self-regulatory systems, and this means basically that in practice all research performing organizations and maybe also higher education institutions have opted for national code of conduct and a sort of procedure that acts as and there's a body that oversees the whole procedure, and I think this is also the case in Finland. And then there are some like legal systems, and this means that there's a law relating to research integrity. Usually the laws leave very much a discretion to local committees and the National Research Integrity Office, because the law might describe these, like, for example, research misconduct in very broad terms, and it is impossible basically to just derive actual decisions from the law when looking at the case by this. So we can categorize these countries like this, but please keep in mind that these are more blurry than it seems from these clear-cut categorizations. The next aspect is national level research integrity guidelines, and besides, we have countries with a national research integrity office that has drafted a guideline, and this is like a quite clear-cut thing, and we can see them in blue on the map. But there can be also other kinds of recommendations on research integrity, and these are usually recommendations provided by National Academy of Science or a national research funding organization. And especially in the case of research funding organizations, it is quite very, very high incentive to comply with these codes, because it serves as a assessment criteria for also withdrawing the funding. So, and as you can see in yellow, there are not many countries in Europe that would have only national like guidelines for organizations' own guidelines. So we can see that in Europe usually it it is very, very desirable to have some sort of national coordination in these research integrity guidelines. The third variable here in this studies is research integrity training, and why training is highly important in our opinion is that we can see training as a vehicle to bringing these research integrity norms into action, because after reading all those guidelines, usually they don't provide enough information to act, or they are not comprehensive in that sense that they would suffice. But we need research integrity training in order to raise awareness of these questions relating to research integrity and also in research ethics. And here we can see that on yellow there is those integrity offices that do not offer any kind of training in research integrity, but here also the picture is not quite black and white, because mostly they do offer some sort of consultation for policymakers and research organizations. And usually I would say that on some occasions, for example in France, the office is responsible for research integrity education for I think PhD students or even older, more senior researchers. Now I think it's time for conclusions. I don't know how much time do I have left, but I think it's fine. Basically, now we have like 3 variables here, and with these, if we compile all those different maps together, we see that hardly any countries resemble each other, and we could come up with more variables in the study, and with one more variable, of course, it would like make the heterogeneity of these systems appear even greater. But even though European divergences in research integrity regulation run deep, as we can see from this ENRIO Congress, the schemes for fruitful cooperation and co-learning between national research integrity offices have been established, especially regarding cross-border cases with the challenge of legal pluralism. National research integrity systems are interconnected. They are not immutable, but are responsive to the challenges that the academic community at large faces. And I think this is basically one way of harmonization which is quite invisible from public documentation. We have lots of working groups, we have meetings, we have international conferences like this one, and these all act as hubs for very fruitful discussions, adding very much understanding of our respective systems. And in light of these findings, national research integrity offices might benefit from seeking to achieve more similarities than differences in their practice in order to provide a more consistent understanding and practice of research integrity in Europe. This is the last point. I think it's a bit more controversial than the other ones, because there is arguments for keeping like the structure more pluralist, not to try to harmonize too much, but this is still something that I would like to suggest. Thank you, everyone. Here are the references I used here, and I think we have time for questions. All right, Kaila, thank you for paying attention.
Please introduce yourself before asking.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. My name is Jonas Åkerman. I work at Stockholm University as a research integrity and ethics coordinator. I was just, did you actually in the end address this question of whether ethical principles were mere window dressing, or whether there was some very sort of fundamental divergence between the different countries in terms of the principles, not just the codes, because I think the presentation then focused very much on the implementation of the principles, which is, of course, very different. So but maybe I missed something at the end, but did you address that, or do you want to add something about that? Because I think that's a very interesting question.
Thank you for the question. I think that's really well spotted. And in a way, in the manuscript, we are going into more detail about this, like harmonization, and we take some examples from the European human rights law and how this kind of a pluralism may act as a very powerful tool for also in harmonization like process, but in fact we don't have that much data to say anything else, but that we cannot still rule out that these guidelines could be barely window dressing, but nevertheless they are usually national guidelines. There are conventions between research organizations, and whenever there's a national oversight body, I think it becomes quite evident that converges or harmonizes the decisions made in that country, and like the decisions of different organizations, they tend to get more harmonized. But this is a good question, and it remains open in some ways. Thanks.
Another question? Yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. Also related to the previous question, when you raised some worries about the codes of conduct may be perceived just as window dressing, you also say something about the challenges of having these documents actually being implemented in the legal system, and then in the legal use. And one of your results show that there are differences in the legal status of documents across different countries. So my question would be, in those countries where the code of conduct for research integrity is more linked to the legal system, there is some evidence that they are actually more binding, they are enforced in court laws or other kind of investigations?
Thank you. This is a really good question, and I'm happy to discuss this further, because I think what must be bear in mind here is that there's a conflict of legal regulation of research integrity and the autonomy of research institutions, and in European countries, the autonomy of university institutions is crucial. In they have like this huge political importance that universities must remain neutral, and of course in the universities they must obey law. But I would say that the key here is an oversight system, and the oversight system, it's not necessary that it's like codified in law, because it can be a self-regulatory system where institutions opt for this kind of higher structure that is usually self-regulatory by research community, and this is just my personal view, but I tend to think that there are some conflicts that may arise from that, especially when an institution would opt out of that system, but usually it's so integral part of their quality assurance that it's impossible to opt out from a robust self-regulatory system. But I welcome all disagreement on this. Whereas the legal regulation, it has some problems if taken too far. Are the members of the parliament, for example, a right body to tell how the scientific community should regulate itself? I don't know. This is also an open question, but my personal opinions. But thanks, that was a brilliant question.
I don't see any other question. Also online, there isn't questions. So thank you very much, Kalle.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for questions and listening.
And now I would like to welcome Dr. Jonas Åkerman and Dr. Sara Belfrage from Stockholm University, and they is going to talk about how to solve some of the practical problems that emerge in policy creation and implementation.
Okay, so we're ready. Thank you for coming here and to listen to us. So we both work at Stockholm University as research integrity and ethics advisor, we could say. We will talk a little bit about the system in Sweden. It has already been a bit on the screen. I will come back to that, and how we take on our responsibility. So we will mention a few challenges and in particular a specific dilemma that we face and our approach to that. So this is basically our talk. So can I see the slide? Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, the Swedish case has already been mentioned. I don't know if you remember the first map that the previous speaker showed. So Sweden was in blue. We have a law since 2020 on research integrity, or rather on the responsibility for research integrity and for investigating cases of violations of research integrity. And first of all, we have a legal definition of research misconduct, saying that research misconduct is a serious deviation from good research practice in the form of fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, so the FFP, that is committed intentionally or through gross negligence when planning, conducting, or reporting research. So this is the definition that we have. And since 2020, we have a designated authority in charge of investigating research misconduct, and it's called the National Board for Assessment of Research Misconduct, and for short NPOF. And as we speak, there is another talk in another room presenting the work of that authority thus far. But this does not mean that that universities don't have any responsibilities, because we still do. And those responsibilities include to examine other deviations from good research practice, because obviously all kinds of deviations from good research practice are not covered by this definition of research misconduct. And in the ALIA code, you know, the list of other problematic or wrongful practices, let's say. So it is the task of the universities to examine those. And we also have to forward cases to NPOF to assist and provide NPOF with information, and to offer advice and support on research integrity. And last, but really not least, it's rather perhaps the most important task, is of course to prevent deviations from good research practice. So this is what we do at the university level. And now, we face some challenges. First category of challenges has to do with what to examine and how, and given the sometimes messy and unclear situation when it comes to division of responsibilities. For example, how to ensure that issues end up in the right place and are properly handled, because as I'm sure you know, cases of research or allegations of deviations from good research practice tend to be messy. They include lots of stuff. Some things are clear, some things are not clear, and some things have been handled in a way before. Some things are not handled, and they can be seen as examples of different kinds. So we need to sort out where should this issue be placed so that it doesn't end up nowhere. and also how to handle overlaps with other authorities' domains. And one particular problem has to do with ethical review, because in Sweden we also have a law on ethical review, and other authorities in charge of the ethical review and in charge of violations of the ethical review requirements. But as you know, violating ethical review requirements may also be seen as a deviation from good research practice. So this is also a bit unclear. And also overlaps within the university. We have different administrative functions, different departments in charge of different aspects of this. There may be harassment allegations, for example. So this is a challenge to navigate in this system and to ensure that we take on the responsibility of the university in a good way. There is also a potential tension between universities' different roles and responsibilities, and in particular, when it comes to our task, our responsibility, and it is primarily our responsibility to offer advice and support on the one hand, and on the other hand, to examine deviations and forward cases to NPOF. So here is, we have described this in terms of a dilemma, and I will just read this through. So researchers who observe or experience questionable practices, they come to us for information, support, and guidance. And they are often in distress. They need to discuss in order to sort out how to label and understand what has happened, because sometimes they just feel that something is wrong. They don't really know how to describe it, but something doesn't feel right. And they don't know, is this illegal? Is this the way it should be done? Does this happen all the time? So they need help to sort of understand what happened and to categorize it. And they rely on us and expect confidentiality. And we think that our support is instrumental when it comes to making those people ready to file a report later on. So they need this process to discuss with us in order to decide what to do. But at the same time, we have a duty to report alleged deviations. This is, we also represent the university, so this is also our responsibility, and to make sure that irregularities are not covered up. So how are we to combine these objectives? Because sometimes the researchers are not ready to report. They think that the risks are too high. It's not worth it. They don't dare doing it. So what should we do then? Because we need to build trust in us, in the university, and of course in the scientific enterprise as a whole.
And we're going to focus here, since we don't have that much time, on one aspect of this, namely this, how the roles are designed at the university, what the different roles are and how they interact. So this is very coarse-grained, of course, but three broad alternative approaches to this dilemma in terms of roles. So you might want to completely separate the roles. There are, of course, that's good in a sense. It becomes very clear who is doing what, and if you have good information about this, who to turn to, and you will not have these, maybe you can avoid this dilemma by having one function which is completely responsible for the reporting and investigating part, and another one who's only responsible for the support part. So that's nice in that way. But there is this risk that we have also seen in some cases in certain aspects of support and administrative work at the university, and that there's a risk that you will work in silos, and of course, relatedly, that you will have too narrow focus in these different functions. So I think this actually relates a little bit to the things that came up in a presentation yesterday about the research integrity being very broad. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that, and Sarah touched upon that as well. These reports or this suspicions about something not being right, they can include a lot of things. And if you have very narrow focus on, for instance, only GDPR or only ethical review, then you might not get the kind of support that you need. You might get also maybe not the right advice. And of course, being narrow focused might also lead to there being gaps, competence gaps. So you might have functions with very narrowly defined tasks, and then you might have things that fall in between. So that those are a couple of risks with that kind of role separation. If you mix the roles, of course, then if you mix them too much or in a way that is not well considered, then you will have trust issues. And by trust issues here, I mean primarily what Sarah touched upon. Will they trust us and come to us and expect sort of some degree of confidentiality, at least, if they also think that we might report them or file a report on their behalf to AMPOF or to the relevant function at university. So that's one thing. And also, of course, it can damage the integrity of roles and processes if we are both involved in giving support and then also involved in the investigation at university or with the interaction with AMPOF. That might be problematic as well and might undermine the trust in a different sense. So we think that some sort of middle way is the most desirable way to go. And this is very, I mean, it's not very precise, but maybe we'll see from the examples what we mean. Something that's practically tenable, of course, needs to work in practice because this is really implementation, like balanced and holistic approach, so that you can take this holistic perspective on research integrity and ethics and make sure that you have this kind of broad competence and also involve all of these different functions. No matter how you define them, you will have expertise in various parts of the university at different functions that you might need to involve, and you can have a good interaction and sort of take a holistic approach to it in both of those senses. We think that's essential to giving adequate support and also still upholding the integrity of these different roles and functions. But there is still a challenge here, how to balance this. Some of the most important factors for this are the following. There might be more, but these are things that we have been thinking about. So one thing is that I think it's very good to have a function where the relevant competences and experiences are collected. Some sort of our research integrity, research ethics hub. It might be done in various ways, but so that you get the functions together or have a function which has a broad area of responsibility. And of course, then you need broad competence and experience. So you need to have people who actually work with these things in a broad way, because experience is crucial to learning how to handle these things in an appropriate way. And also, of course, make sure that these people have the time to stay updated with the guidelines and regulations and so on. Clear structures, to have policies, procedures, and responsibilities defined as far as possible. I mean, that also came up in a talk yesterday that policies can't do everything. You also need, so if I jump to the point on good balance, you need to have good judgment and be able to strike a good balance between, for instance, openness and confidentiality. So policies won't do all of it, but it's also very nice, very, I think, essential as well to have a policy to lean back on. Involvement in networks, projects, and also dialogue, collaboration, and across functions and institutions, where you also have respect for each other's competence, so that you can have a good exchange without stepping on each other's toes or I mean, educate one another in the wrong kind of way, if you see what I mean. I mean, you should educate one another, but you should still be open to learning from each other as well. It shouldn't be one way; it should be go both ways. It should be mutual respect and learning, and of course, support and prioritizing from leadership at different levels is crucial here as well. And this is just a figure to sort of map this difference. I mean, collaboration between these different functions and competence. I mean, meeting someone who knows what they're talking about and gives the impression. Be open. I mean, not give the impression of trying to hide anything, but also strike a balance between that and confidentiality. We think that is all of this is essential to build the kind of trust that you need in this context and in this kind of support and monitoring administrative work.
Yeah, just some final words to describe our work and how we have structured it at Stockholm University. So we have an ethics support function, and it could also be called integrity and ethics support function, but in Swedish, we tend to use the term ethics rather broadly. So we have this support function it's placed at the Office for Research, Engagement and Innovation Services. So many of our colleagues help researchers get funding, basically. So it's a very much appreciated office compared to many of the other offices of the university, we should say. We are 2 full-time employees, so the university has decided to, give resources to this. And the tasks that we have include support to researchers. We give them information and guidance based on not only regulations, but also guidelines and declarations, as well as established practice. So we need to have the broad picture. We also support university leadership, and we help them act responsibly and do what is their job. Different levels of university leadership. So it can be the heads of department, but also the director and so on. And to stay updated in this area, we are in charge of governing documents of the university in this area. And we handle reports of deviation from this administrative point of view. And we are tasked to stay updated in the field of research integrity and research ethics from a legislative, political, academic, and public debate perspective. And these recent years, lots of things have happened in Sweden. So there's an ongoing debate about many of the things that we have discussed, including ethical review and so on. And we also try to contribute to the progress of research integrity and ethics in the national and international setting. So this is part of why we are here to contribute and to participate. So this was what we planned to say. If you have questions more about practicalities of the dilemma that we spelled out, we could talk about that too, but we are open for questions. Thank you
very much. So we have time for one or two. We have time for one or two questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. My name is Vidar Envak. I'm from Norway, and we have some of the same history in Norway with the research ethics laws being implemented in the last years. But we have more experience because we got these laws in 2007. And so we have some experience with how to handle this in Norway, which might be relevant, because one of the biggest challenges we have in Norway is that we try to achieve sort of a holistic kind of unity approach, but there are fundamental distinctions here. For instance, we have 3 different laws that regulates. I mean, it's GDPR, Personal Data Protection, it's Health Research Act on health research, and it's Research Ethics Acts. And if we get too holistic, those 3 laws get confused. And it's hard to guide people and to give advice what law is actually the one that you're breaching or not following. And to take one specific example, it's a huge problem now to explain to researchers what is informed consent. Is it something required by the Health Research Act? Is it something required by GDPR? Or is it something required as an ethical principle, maybe not even defined by law? And our problem in Norway is that we are in a situation where we have a public debate about the problems of this ethical regulation system, which has become so complicated that it creates distrust in research integrity systems. So one of the biggest challenges we have is that there is a distrust in the things that we do, because we are sort of no longer capable of giving good advice and guidance in this field, which has been so complicated. So I would just sort of try to have your reflections on the other models, sort of having a unity at a university, which is very capable of telling people the differences between those things, instead of having this holistic unity kind of approach. So because there are overlaps, but there are also tensions and contradictions, which we tend to underemphasize. And underemphasizing tensions and contradictions, they will blow up later. So just to have your reflections on that.
Yeah, I would say that by holistic approach, we mean exactly this: to be able to know which law is relevant in what case. So it's a problem if you only know the GDPR, for example, because then you will definitely not give the right answer and good advice, because we have the Ethical Review Act that is related to the GDPR. But I mean, you need to know both, and there are also other laws and regulations and established practice. So by a holistic approach, we mean that you need to be aware of all of this, and perhaps we don't know the details about the archiving law, for example. So that's why we need to involve also people who work on that, because we see that there might be some restrictions concerning what we can do with data, for example, due to archiving requirements. So this is exactly what we mean by the holistic approach, that you need to see the full picture and to be aware of all the different things that together makes a very complicated situation for researchers to navigate themselves.
I think your case actually illustrates our main point. I mean, and the consent case is particularly illustrative. I mean, because you need consent for all of those reasons in various cases. I mean, you have various legal demands, and then of course you also have the ethical principle. And this needs to be balanced and considered in the practical and legal context that you find yourself. And if that context is complex, because then you definitely need a holistic approach. Otherwise, you're going to miss something.
My name is Marcus Siedel from the Austrian Student Ombuds Office. I have a very practical question. So in this dilemma, if somebody comes to you and presents their evidence, and you have the impression that this is something you have to report because it's really important, but this person is totally against reporting it, how do you deal with such a situation?
Well, first of all, of course, you need to be transparent, and you need to tell people who come to us that, I mean, we have this obligation. So when you tell us about your case, think about this. So if you give us too much information and you want to keep, you know, the decision for yourself to make, then you shouldn't tell us everything. But they tend to forget that, and then they tell us everything anyways. And of course, so far we've been lucky, and they have decided to move on, or the head of department has filed a report. So we have been lucky, but we can definitely see a case, especially if it is research which endangers people. We don't have that much research of that kind at Stockholm University, but still there may be such cases. And then I don't know, we don't have a good answer to this dilemma, but of course we need to be, we can't deceive them and not let them know that we have this obligation.
We have a general strategy of being very clear about what their responsibility is, and what their superiors' responsibility is, and what they should expect in terms of support from the department, and sometimes people even try to help them find someone if the head of department might be involved, or the dean. It can be very complicated. We might try to help them find someone at the faculty, or someone with knowledge of the area who can advise them and support them, because it's also for us to file the report. That would be unfortunate in many ways. I mean, I've seen enough of these cases to know that when you get one side of the story, there's usually a lot of things missing, and you might feel like this is horrible. This has to be reported. I mean, this is the worst thing I've ever seen at the university, and I've had that experience several times, and then it turns out, well, there's another side to the story, and then it's good to sort of make them consider the whole picture, and also the consequences for themselves and colleagues before reporting. They should report if it's mandated. I mean, if it's motivated, of course, but we try to support them in realizing what to do and take the responsibility. I think that's the best we can do. So that's some way towards the solution to the dilemma, but it's, of course, there might be tricky situations when that won't work either.
Last but not least, Jacopo Ambrosj will introduce his analysis of 25 national research integrity codes.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the previous speakers for their interesting talks. My talk is going to be a little bit different, as I'm not going to tackle directly the legal implementations of codes of conduct for research integrity, but I'm going to speak to some theoretical assumptions that lie in these codes, that then, of course, we think that have an impact and influence how the codes are implemented also in the legal system. And so this was the title of my talk. Then the manuscript got revised several times, and now this is the new title. It's co-authored with Professor Desmond and Professor Dirks, who's here in the audience. So the outline for today is that I'm first going to say something very quickly in general about codes of conduct for research integrity. Then I'm going to talk about why we think they imply some sort of ideal of research and how this could influence the implementation of the codes. And then I'm going to present the main findings of the content analysis on which this study is based, very quickly, of course, for the sake of time. And I'd like to leave you with some conclusions. So codes of conduct for research integrity, we all know what they are. But they also come in high variation. There could be geographical variation. There are international, national, regional codes, and they could be also the intended use and how they relate to the legal system. It was stressed in the first talk could be different. Some are more connected to the legal system of the country. Some are not. Generally speaking, we can say they have an aspirational character. So they point to a direction. They somehow represent the vision that the research community has to what proper research should be. And in this sense, we say that they imply some ideal of research, what good, proper research should be. Nonetheless, this ideal aspect notwithstanding, they have practical implication via the multiple functions they play. For instance, we can see that they have an educational function when they are used as a basis for developing educational courses, trainings for PhD students, for instance. They have a self-regulative function within the community, which then can be enforced, can be implemented in the legal system too. As all the research integrity practices, there is also this intended aim of safeguarding public trust to an extent. All of these functions and many more have very their own challenges in the implementation. We had a workshop yesterday that focused on that, so I'm not going to focus on the challenges of the implementations here. Okay. I'm missing an animation, but yeah. But I want to go to the ideal part, the ideal that these codes have assume more or less. So codes of conduct have more or less implicitly offer an answer to the question what proper research should look like, what we want research to be. And this is somehow a philosophical question. And in fact, it is discussed within the philosophy of science community. But because this ideal of science that is implied in codes of conduct informs the content of the codes and that then are implemented in different practices of research integrity, these philosophical questions have practical consequences, implications for research integrity practices. So the general idea is that the ideal of science of research, scientific research that is implied in codes of conduct informs the codes, and the codes then informs the practices. Of course, it's not a direct influence. It's not that an answer to these philosophical questions have a direct influence on the research integrity practices, but you may see a path from the theorization to the practice. Okay, and what are these philosophical questions that philosophers ask when they ask, oh, what should be our best ideal of science? What proper scientific research should look like? Well, these mainly concern whether or not researchers should strive to make their work value-free, that is, independent from any sort of external influence and interest. And we may say, well, of course, we want research to be objective, and therefore it should be not influenced by external factors. In practice, it's a little bit more complicated, and there are good arguments to think that to some extent, it is inevitable that some influence of values is in place in science. And then the question is, to what extent can values or other non-scientific interests influence research? And then, more importantly, how to tell a legitimate influence of or from legitimate influence of values, interest factor into scientific research. So here I want to give you examples, because of course you may say, oh, it's very easy to do this, because for example, we have Lysenkoism, the scientific doctrine in the Soviet Union that was rejecting Darwinism because of political interests. We can say, oh, this was clearly an illegitimate way in which, in this case, political values were influencing research, and in fact were somehow preventing Russian and other Soviet researchers to make any progress in research. On the other case, for example, in the infamous case of the Tuskegee syphilis study, where some people from minority groups were not told that they were given a placebo, so they were not actually treated for several years, with, of course, consequences for their health. In these cases, we want our values to influence research. In this case, values such as respect for human life would have told us to stop that, never do that wicked experiment. And so these are very clear cases, but they lay on the extremities. Most of the cases are in a gray area. For instance, to what extent can some other interests of researchers influence them? Most codes of conduct ask researchers to disclose conflict of interest, but not necessarily to avoid them. And in those cases, how can you tell whether or not the interest at stake it's actually influencing the researcher towards a direction that doesn't meet the criteria of research integrity? So the question is, how do codes of conduct for research integrity answer these fundamental philosophical questions? Do they allow for this influence, or do they ban such influence? And so we ran a content analysis of 25 leading national documents from different European countries, trying to map the guidance that researchers receive on how to deal with external values, interest factors in their research work. Now I will summarize very briefly the results, and I also have some examples just to give you a grasp of what is at stake, but of course it's going to be quite incomplete. So there is an endorsement in almost all the codes of some form of value-free ideal. That is, there are some very general statements about the fact that researchers should be independent, should be somehow neutral, should not suffer from the pressure from, for example, political parties. Yet at the same time, we identified some tensions, in particular between these general endorsement of the freedom and independence of science and other passages stressing the importance of social interest. And I have an example from the Code of Ethics of Research of the Czech Academies of Sciences, where they ask researchers to observe the principles of neutrality and independence of ideological and political pressures. And at the same time, researchers are asked to make every effort to ensure that their practical usable research results serve society. So there's somehow a tension between being isolated, not being influenced by the political landscape, but at the same time to pursue societal goals. Okay, and then we also found in this sense, as concerned the influence of different interests in society, what we call open guidance, that is very, let's say, a vague guidance that doesn't offer criteria to researchers to make an evaluation, but researchers are asked themselves to make an evaluation of whether or not the interest at stake is legitimate or not. And I have one very telling example from the Estonian Code of Conduct for Research Integrity, saying that researchers have to assess critically the impact of the conflict of interest, knowing that not all the conflicts have an inappropriate influence. So it's like you have to evaluate that because not all of them are detrimental to, are inappropriate, or illegitimate. But then how to do this, it's not very explicit in the code. It seems to be left to the researchers themselves. So some conclusions. Research integrity codes don't offer a univocal answer to the fundamental epistemic question, those philosophical questions I was raising at the beginning. But of course, there could be potential consequences for the functions of research integrity codes, because of course it's going to influence the content of the codes that are used as base for educational trainings, and it could influence the self-regulative function. For example, in the case of conflict of interest, the previous quote, researchers are not given much guidance on how to tell a legitimate from an illegitimate influence. And in turn, it could also affect public trust, because maybe the public wants scientists to be somehow shielded from other interests. They don't want any sort of influence, external influence. And some passages that seem to say that researchers could have conflict of interest, for instance, may undermine the trust of the public. Yeah, and the general idea, of course, this is very sketchy. It's in real life, it's way more complicated than this. But the idea is always that the ideal that the codes of conduct endorse influence the codes of conduct, and the codes influence the practices. So, how to integrate values? For example, the interests of society in the Tuskegee example, or as required by the Czech Code of Conduct in the previous example, in scientific research, without jeopardizing the impartiality and the objectivity of research. So also the integrity of research is a delicate issue. And of course, codes of conduct should not be expected to completely solve this issue. They are not philosophical dissertations. They are not meant to solve these sort of very delicate and complicated issues. But at least because they are addressed to researchers, and researchers are the special profession who's in the business of producing knowledge, they should at least be acknowledged. We oftentimes, when we talk about integrity, we focus on the ethical part, which of course is important, but we should never forget that we're talking about people actually producing knowledge. So some epistemic issues have to be at least acknowledged. And some conceptual work could contribute to increase clarity, in the sense to make at least to make explicit that researchers could face this sort of dilemmas. And then in the paper, we have some suggestion on how to do this. But for the sake of the presentation, I think my time is almost running out. But the general idea is that if we have clearer codes, then after some passages in between, we could also have improved research integrity practices. And this was my 15 minutes talk.
Thank you very much. It's time for questions. Yes.
Thank you, Jacopo. It was really interesting and a talk, and I really look forward to reading the paper when it's published. I was just thinking, perhaps, I don't know if you saw yesterday morning the first session, and there was a talk about activism in research, and they had, I don't know if you think of this like the tension that arises from the codes of conduct, like this is like this, basically the idea of research with and for society type of thing, that it should benefit the society. Would you think that to resolve this conflict, or not even resolve, but mitigate it a bit, it would, this distinction between I think it was neutrality and impartiality would be beneficial to, like, obviously, if research is conducted for some good purposes, it's not neutral, but it still can be impartial, so that there's no like straight like political pressure for that from a certain party.
Okay, thank you for your question. So I was there for the first main session. I got what the speaker, Professor Rufi, was gesturing at, but maybe for because she didn't have much time to, as we said, these are very complex issues. I was not totally convinced by that distinction between neutrality and impartiality. I think the distinction, it's a one that's very difficult to draw, and it goes back to how to tell legitimate influence from illegitimate influence of non-scientific interest factors. And to go back to your question, I mean, that could be an answer, like if codes of conduct were to include such a distinction, even if it's not super philosophically rigorous, it would already address, acknowledge this issue, and offer, it will acknowledge more openly that there could be these influences in the work of scientists. Scientists are people, citizens, as everyone, and they may be moved by some values, ideals, and not all of them should be considered illegitimate. But yeah, that could be, yeah, that for the purposes of research integrity practices, codes of conduct, yeah, that could do the trick for these purposes. Will not solve the philosophical debate, but that's, nothing can solve philosophical debates.
You next.
Thank you for an interesting talk, and I think you really treat an interesting topic, and it's important not to sort of pretend that there is not this tension between the values that we advocate without thinking that we actually promote values. We also tend to talk about value freeness. But I have a quite a practical question, because you talk of codes of conduct, and at one point you mentioned important or leading documents. So I'm just wondering whether you only include documents that are called codes of conduct, or if you also include like declarations and guidelines, recommendations, because there is many documents that seem to serve more or less the same purpose, but that may be relevant differences.
Yeah, so the question is if I included only documents that call themselves, are titled codes of conduct or not. So, and the answer is no, not all the documents included call themselves explicitly codes of conduct. Some are guidelines or good practices, but they were identified starting from a previous study, the one that was mentioned in the first talk, and the study on harmonizing guidance in Europe by Chris Diericks and Hugh Desmond. And so they identified for each country of Europe one leading document on research integrity. So the document that researchers are, the most authoritative document for each country, if you will, the one that researchers are more likely to know. If researchers actually know codes of conduct, that's another issue. But yes, so there is a variation within the sample we have. Yeah, and of course I skipped that part for presentation's sake, but it is in the paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Really interesting. I was just wondering about this when you compare the Lysenkoism with Tuskegee case. I got the feeling that the comparison there is not really doing its work because they are on different. The comparison is not on the same dimension. I mean, one thing is to influence research in a way that Lysenkoism obviously does, but in the Tuskegee case, I would say that what was lacking there was keeping clear of certain ethical boundaries. I mean, so setting certain boundaries for research. I mean, no matter how good this research is in all other respects, you're never allowed to expose people to risk. And then, of course, there's the whole problem about the people selected for the study and their political issues there, but it's sort of external to research in a sense that it's not in Lysenkoism. So I was just wondering if you how you think about the comparison. I don't think it does really the work that you want to do, and you can probably find a better example if I'm right. But
yeah, thank you. No, I think you're right. I chose that example maybe too quickly because I thought it was a clear example of a case where we want science to be influenced by values. And so there are two ways to answer your concerns. The first is that in a very broad sense, when we put ethical constraints to what research could be done, even those for which we all agree, we're still putting constraints of what can be known, so to the production of knowledge. So this is something that is oftentimes taken for granted and overlooked, because of course we all agree, like, no, we don't want any more Tuskegee cases, we don't want that. But in this way, we are consciously deciding to not to pursue, not to remove from the possibility of what we can know a part of what we could know, and for good reasons, I would say. But a better example where it's clear that values could influence how scientific conclusions are drawn is, for example, if someone is making a study to see if there are some differences between different groups, between different genders, between different racialized groups. For example, a study on how IQ level different between different groups. We would want that study, the sort of study, to have a very high. We would require a very high level of evidence, a lot of evidence before we draw that distinction, before we draw that conclusion. And so in that case, we would raise our evidential standards because of our moral concerns, societal concerns. So that's an example that gets more into how scientists draw conclusions and how values can influence, or should influence in this case, how conclusions are drawn.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. So one alternative for striving for value-free science would be striving for being aware and reflective of the values that influence our research, and maybe being transparent about them. So have you found in the documents that you analyzed, have you found any of these ideas or alternatives, ideas to this value-free science that have been mentioned implicitly?
Thank you for your question. So no, in the sense that the main result was that we couldn't extrapolate a coherent view on values in science from the codes. most of them have these general statements that look like the value-free ideal of science, but then they have other passages that are deviating from that. But something that's it's very interesting is that in the new European Code of Conduct, there's a passage about science communication when the scientists, researchers are talking to the public, and in that case, the document explicitly, sorry. So in that case, the document explicitly required researchers to be transparent about any value that may influence them. But that's the only passage in the European Code of Conduct where this is mentioned, that values may influence researchers, values other than the principles of research integrity, of course.
Unfortunately, we have time for last question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk and lots of big questions. I'll focus on a more specific question, which might also be directed to Kalle. It has to do with the distinction between code of conduct and guidelines. Because in Kalle's presentation, these documents are lumped together as research integrity guidelines. And in your presentation, it's like code of conduct. And my question is whether it's useful to make a distinction, because there are different types of text. So for instance, in the Norwegian guidelines, those are ethical guidelines. They are built on ethical principles, fundamental principles, and they suggest how you might reflect on different topics so that you can take responsibility yourself by building up an ethical reflection. So the aim of the text is to invite reflection and responsibility. Code of conduct has a different function. They are not on the level of reflection, but action, conduct and practice, what is right to do and wrong to do. And a very important function of code of conduct is to investigate misconduct. So they have a normative function in their self, which is very different from ethical guiding texts, which are more embedded in the academic community, not necessarily linked to investigation of misconduct. So it's just a question whether you or Kalle might find it useful to make a distinction between ethical guidelines and code of conduct. And then to the other questions you raised, how to handle this, for instance, conflict of interest, all those questions that might arise. Our suggestion, as it is done in Norway, is basically to include that in a huge section in the guidelines. Like, let's make that explicit. How to balance, for instance, impartiality and neutrality. How to act in public debates where you are engaged. Simply to form how to act with stakeholders, funders, collaborators that might try to influence your research. And maybe then just to outline that in guidelines which are simple, that you can use as a source of reflection. So it's just a simple answer to how that might be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you thank you so much for the question and also for sharing this. So I will start from the second part of your question. Yes, that seemed to be a very efficient way to do that. It's a sign that document you're referring to, it's quite advanced, but still, and maybe this is making the link with the first part of your question. As complete as that list you offer may be, it's never going to map every single decision that researchers are going to face in real life, and so I think it's important for scientific research to an extent to rely on the regulatory aspects. So researchers should be committed to the principles of research integrity and be able and be trained to make these decisions by themselves. But generally speaking, yes, there is a difference between the purposes, the intended use of different documents that could make a difference. This is, I think, the first study trying to map what ideal of scientific research is embedded in documents of research integrity. So we were trying to focus on what could be considered the leading document independently of the function, because we wanted to have somehow an authoritative question answers to the question. We wanted it to be we took these documents to be let's say the representative of the dominant view, if we may say, of the national landscape. And yeah, I think maybe I wanted to say something else, but I lost track. Sorry. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. I think this is a really good question, and we shouldn't forget anyhow that there's quite a lot of overlap between guidelines and code of conduct. This is like just an incident, but in the Finnish code of conduct was called, its English translation was called RCR guideline, and it describes the procedure of misconduct investigation, and now it's a code of conduct on research integrity. So I think it's not so clear-cut, this division, and I think this is something that there should be more conceptual clarity, and you are absolutely right, I think, but that's not how it is. I'm sorry.
I think I remember what I wanted to say, that codes of conduct, it's been said that have more of a normative aim, and they are meant to be used in, for example, investigation of cases of misconduct. But at the same time, the European Code of Conduct of Research Integrity present itself as a framework for making decisions, and it is stated very clearly that it's not to be considered a legal document. So then the difference is between what is a normative document with ethical implications and what is a legal document with also legal implications. And yeah, that's a topic maybe for another session.
Thank you very much, Jacopo. Thank you all of you for your participation, and I'm inviting you to the lunch.